that we'll be able to create some lighting effects inside of later on, but the rotoscope is actually going to play a vital part in the lighting effect itself. So I want to do the rotoscoping first. So to do that, I'm going to want to duplicate my footage and put that inside of the pre-comp. Now, because I don't want the footage affecting my final render, it's only there as a guide, I'm going to change that duplicate to a guide layer. So I'll select my layer here, hit Control D to duplicate it, then I'll go to Layer and choose Guide Layer. So that's going to be right here. You might not be able to see it because it's kind of going off the recording area, but it's just right there. And now you can see that's a guide layer. And then I'll pre-compose this. So I'll hit Control-Shift-C. We'll move our attributes in, and I'm going to call this left leg because I need two separate ones for each leg. So we'll have a left leg, and then I'll come up here in the project panel. I'm duplicating it in the project panel instead of on the timeline because I want it to be a totally different composition that I can do different things inside of. So with left leg selected, I'll hit Control D here in the project panel. Again, I'll rename that to right leg. And now that's going to be a different comp. It's not referencing the left leg. But it does have the same information inside of it, so we don't have to create that guide layer and duplicate it. It just saves a little bit of time. Now I'm also going to color code these to be more like what I envision as far as the right leg is farther away, so it's darker. The left leg is closer, so we got a little bit more light on that, and that's going to help us. And if I go in here, you can see there is the guide layer. So outside of this comp is where I need to begin creating my rotoscope. And I really don't have to start creating it until around frame 70 or so, because that's when this starts to light up. So that's when we'll start needing that relight information. So no use matching all this time here when you don't really need it. So I'm also going to turn off the ground relight because that makes it a little bit harder to scrub. You can see it's a lot faster scrubbing now. So right in here around frame 70, I'm going to kick this off. Make sure I have left leg selected, grab the pen tool, and we'll just come in here and begin rotoscoping on our actor's skin. And I'm only doing the skin because you really only need that to get the effect that it is casting light. You'd be amazed at how much you think, you know, oh, well, we need to do this whole area. You really don't. The skin is really the only part that you can really tell a big difference or lack of integration. And so for that reason, we're not going to bother ourselves with trying to match our mask to all the other parts of him. It's just going to be the legs. Okay, so we've got that first mask created on our left leg, and I'm going to open up that mask option there, and we'll go ahead and key our path. And then let's move backwards a little bit, and I'll just toggle back over, hitting the V key to my selection tool, and we'll kind of position that. I'll hit enter, and then we can go in and select some of these points and begin placing that to fit the leg a little bit better. Perfect. So now we've got this nice little kind of following along action here. Okay, so we've already done a lot of rotoscoping in between lessons for our actual actor, but this one is going to be a little more difficult just in that it's going to need to be perfect. The other one, you kind of had some room, you know, of interpreting this area is so dark, where exactly did the pants end and begin? It's really up to you. That's kind of just this area I've chosen for that. But when it's playing back, you can't tell. This is really going to be obvious if it's not perfect. So take some time in between lessons to get that rotoscope into place. I'm going to come back in the next lesson and it will be exactly where it should be. And I'll also have the rotoscope finished for the right leg as well. And then I'm going to show you an amazing trick for being able to take our rotoscope and then use it as what we'll need for the actual lighting trick that we're going to do, and how we're going to get it to look like he's actually been relit and that the ball is actually casting this colorful light onto his shin and the back of his calf. So it's important to get that perfect because it's not only just the mask, it's also part of the actual relight. So stick around, and in the next lesson we'll have this rotoscope finished, and I'll show rotoscopes that match up really, really nicely with our legs. And you can see as I scrub through here, it's following along perfectly with those legs. Now we've also got our left leg rotoscope, and it also follows along perfectly with the leg. So what I want to do is take this rotoscope and turn it into a shape layer that lives inside of the pre-comp. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we need to copy the mask path and its properties into the mask, or rather the contents of a shape layer in the form of a path. So how do you do that? You're going to come over to the first frame of where that animation begins. I'm just going to select all the frames just like this, and I'll hit Control C. Then we're going to go inside of this layer, and we're just going to go to Layer, New, and create a shape layer. Then we'll come in here, and I'm just going to click to create a contents for that. So we have a contents tab to open up, and a shape to open up, and a path to open up. So you can see it's pretty deep down in here. And then I'm just going to select the path and hit Control V, and it's going to paste this in. Now you can see that because I didn't have this selected quite right, it pasted it in as a mask, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to undo that by hitting Control Z, and I'm going to select this little path as well, and hitting Control V. Now the path with the stopwatch, you can see it's been pasted in place. And you can see that it also gave it some content that maybe we're not too thrilled about. So let's go ahead and fix that. So the fill, I don't want any fill for it, but I am interested in it having a stroke because that's what we're going to use to create the lighting effect. Now right now you can see this looks crazy, but trust me, it's going to be pretty amazing when we're done. So I'm going to come right over here to the first frame where we see this little effect starting. And I'm just going to increase this to about 5 pixels so it's a little bit bigger and a little bit easier for us to see. And what I want to do is whenever the ball is, on the side here, just like that, where it would be illuminating his leg, I want this line, but I only want it for right here. But there's going to be other times when, say, the ball is behind him, like here, where I'll want this side of his leg to be illuminated. So we are going to be adding the trim paths effect, which is only available for shape layers, so that we can animate the trim and the offset of this stroke. Pretty amazing. So we're going to go to Add and choose Trim Paths. And then I'm just going to open this up, and you can see that when I start to take some away, we've got this little line. Now I can also animate the offset property, and I'm just going to do that right now so that I can make sure that this is just kind of starting right there in the corner, and then I can animate however much end I want it to have. So right in there is perfect. So now I'll go ahead and key the end and the offset so that we'll be having this relight happening where we want it to. So for the most part, that looks pretty good. We could probably say, right here, we'll want to, let's see, we'll go back a frame right before that kind of comes up, maybe right in here, and set another keyframe. And then when this really starts to look like it's too much, we'll go ahead and just push that offset down a little bit like that. So that will kind of cover that better. And don't worry if it looks a little jagged up here, because we are going to be blurring it so much it won't be noticeable, and it'll be cut out by the rotoscope that's on the outside. So just get it as close as possible. Now when we're right here, the light won't be cast anywhere on the leg that we can see, because the light is basically passing around on the other side, not on this side. So what we need to do is right about here when it goes pretty far away, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and key the actual position of the shape layer. So I'll select the layer and hit the P key. And basically, I don't want it back in place till about right here. So here, I'll go ahead and key again. And then what I want to do is kind of in between here, I want this to begin sort of moving away. So I'll just go a couple frames over and say at this point I want it to be about right here. So that's going to make it look like it's kind of fading off, because once this line becomes blurred later in our effect, we'll really be able to see how that looks. So it's just kind of moving away a little bit. And then about 2 frames before this, we'll want this to be moved kind of out here like that. Now in between here, I don't want this to be visible at all. So I'm going to go 1 frame earlier and actually pull this completely out of view. And then I'll go 1 frame later from this one, and this will still be completely out of view. So at least out of view of our rotoscope. So this is kind of what we end up with. Now this doesn't look quite right yet because we haven't animated the line to go back over onto the other side. So we need to go ahead and go back in here and take a look at our contents and of our shape and our path. There we go. And what we want to have happen is right here where this goes away, we want this to go around to the other side. So let's move back when we can see this again, and we'll go ahead and tell it go over to the other side. So we'll go to this frame where it's really nice and in place, and we'll go ahead and key that. So that's going to be in your trim paths, and you can just move, probably want to move the offset first. So we'll move it just right there where it's at the back and top of his calf muscle, and we'll go ahead and actually we'll use this as the end point here. So we'll push that forward a little bit more and maybe pull the end back just slightly. There we go. And so then just before that, when we're about right here, we want these same options. So I'm going to pull that back. There we go. So now you can see that's going to be kind of like this for us. Now I don't want to see this moving like this, so another thing we'll do is go ahead and set a keyframe for the end, since we don't have one that matches up with our offset here. So on this frame right here, we'll set another keyframe, and then we'll just copy and paste those keyframes to originate right before the move. So we'll hit Control C, Control V, and what we'll end up with is this. Perfect. So it's kind of a quick little change as the ball moves behind him, but it's going to look great once we finish that up. So let's just do a little bit more here. We'll be able to also key just how much this is affecting it on the outside. So just make sure that it's on the right side at least. Okay, so here it's going to start moving back around, kind of the same story. So here it's still technically we'd be on the back, we just wouldn't see very much of it, but you can see it's kind of crept down onto his ankle a little bit. So that's because it's just a little too long. So we'll go ahead and key the end and the offset here, and then we'll come in here where it really gets too long, and we'll go ahead and pull the end back a little and then push it up in the offset. So that'll kind of move with him and get a little bit shorter over time, just like we need it to. Now right about here, it still looks like we might have a little bit of an issue. So I'm going to push that forward a bit before his leg starts to go back the other way, and we'll just push that up onto his leg. Great. And that actually doesn't look half bad until it starts to come in front here. So what we need to have happen is kind of the same thing. So here, actually it's going to be a little bit sooner than that. We'll want to probably right about here key our position again. So we'll just set a keyframe, and then we'll move forward a couple of frames and kind of push this up like that, so that it is keying the position for that to kind of float away. Then we'll say once we get back here, we definitely want this back in place. So I'll just grab this position key and hit Control C, Control V, and that's going to put it back into place. Once we bring this around to the other side, that's going to work out really nicely. But we will want this to be just a little bit offset just before that. Now before this one, I'm going to say, let's take it completely out of view. And this one as well, completely out of view. Okay, so you can kind of see it's the same pattern. Now let's go ahead and fix the trim paths part, so the end and the offset, so it goes back around to the front. So we're starting out here, we're on the back, and then by the time we're back over here again, we want it to be on the front. So we'll go ahead and just slide that on around and grow that end a little bit. And just pull that into place. Perfect. Okay, so again, we don't want to see that kind of wormy thing happening. So what we'll do is say right before here, when we're back in this position, this is where we already want this to be. So I'll grab those keyframes and just pull them back into place. Now here they're perfect, so we actually might need to edit them a little bit for what we want here. So that's easy to do. We can just push that on around and give it a little more room with our end. And that still looks pretty good. I don't think we need to mess with that too much, but if you want to, you can maybe just a little bit by pulling that back and growing that out a little bit there. Great, so that's going to go behind him, then come down and into place. Perfect. And by the time we get to that last frame, that might be a little bit much, but again, it's going to be cut out, so don't worry too much about that. And if you need to change it later, you certainly can. Now, this same process we need to repeat for the other leg. So we're going to do that between lessons, so we end up with exactly the same thing on the inside of the other leg as far as copying and pasting the mask path from the right leg to the inside as a shape layer. So you can kind of see when we're on the outside here what that looks like on his leg. That's not the final effect. We'll be finishing that off and making that look really pretty for both legs in the next lesson, but between lessons, do go ahead and practice this technique of grabbing the mask, creating it as a shape layer, and then animating the legs. And you can see they don't match up at all until frame 70, and then it's kind of just like this magic happens and everything starts working together. Now remember, we have the stroke inside of the rotoscoped layers, so that's why we see the rotoscopes, and that's why it can look maybe a little thicker at times than others. It's just depending on how it's overlapping with the rotoscope, especially right here where the light follows along with the ball. So kind of on this leg, you can see I took a different approach because the ball is close to the leg. I wanted to see that transition instead of making it go off screen for a second. So one other thing to keep in mind is that this leg is behind the other leg, so even though we have a rotoscope keeping it from falling off the edge of the leg, the rotoscope for this leg also needs to be affecting the back leg because I shouldn't be able to see the back of this leg through the other leg. So I can really quickly and easily fix that by just moving to that first keyframe of the left leg mask, and I don't even need the other options here that I've keyed, the feather and the expansion, all that stuff. Just grab the mask path, hit Control C, and then go to the right leg and hit Control V, and now we'll have that same mask just now on the other leg. But instead of having it set to add, we need to change it to subtract. So that way it'll cut it away when we don't want it. So you can see now when this goes behind, it will disappear. And that's exactly what we want, instead of having it being visible like it was a moment ago right there. Perfect. Okay, so now that the masking is taken care of, let's go into our left leg and start playing around with our lighting effect. So we've got our shape layer 1 here, and what I want to do is kind of change the way that this is looking a little bit and start creating kind of this very soft looking light. So what I'll do is duplicate the stroke and use some other colors. So this original one I'm going to go in and change to kind of an orange color. So just kind of the most quintessential orange in After Effects is going to be FF6000. So that's kind of just the perfect right in the middle orange. And then I'm going to duplicate this layer, Control D, and come in and change this one to a more yellow color. And I was playing around with some colors earlier, and FFD E00 is going to be a really nice yellow, just kind of pretty typical buttery looking yellow. And then I'm going to duplicate this again and just make this one white, the one that goes on top. So you can see how that will kind of create a gradient. Now already this is starting to look kind of hot just because we've got a little bit of that color peeking through. But we can do even more by changing the stroke widths. So the stroke width of the white one I'm going to turn all the way down to like 2 pixels. The yellow one I'm going to take down to 3 pixels. And then I'm going to leave the orange one at 5. So you can see how that's starting to create, again, this kind of hot, almost neon looking light, and that's way too harsh. So let's go and open up our effects and presets panel, and we're going to grab some lens blurs. So we'll drop a camera lens blur first on the orange layer, that's the bottom one, and I'm going to blur this even more. So I'm going to take this up to like a 13, so you can see it's pretty soft. And then for the second one here, we'll also drop this on, and this one will increase just a little bit from the default. Maybe just, in fact, maybe we should just decrease it a little bit. Let's just try a 3 for that one. And then for the white, we'll do a 2. So kind of the same blur radius as the pixel radius. There we go. So you can see kind of how that's creating that very soft looking light. But it's still maybe not soft enough. So what I'd like to do now is select all 3 of those shape layers. We'll hit Control-Shift-C, and I'm going to call this, in fact, I'm going to cancel that really quickly. I'm going to do it with all these layers. We'll hit Control-Shift-C, and we'll call this lighting shapes. Okay, and then we'll add a camera lens blur to this, and that's going to help to really start to soften that out. And we can even increase that a little bit more, something like maybe 15, really going to make this a very, very soft effect. And then let's maybe just add a glow to it and see how that looks. We'll just drop that on. So that's going to make it a little bit brighter, but it's going to help overall with just kind of reinforcing that it's going to be a little bit hotter on the inside and cooler on the outside, hence those colors. Okay, now let's jump out to this outer screen here, and you can see we've created this little lighting effect on our guy. Now I'm going to come in here and change my blending mode. So I'm going to change here on the left leg from normal to add, and if you feel like add is too much, you can change it to screen, and that actually I think looks a lot better. Now if you're feeling like this is too much, you can go in and turn down the opacity. So I would definitely recommend turning the opacity down to something like right in there. And also at this point the ball is pretty far away, so we don't want it to be relit right away, but right in here, this is where we're really wanting that effect. And then it's going to move back, you can see, and then it's on the back of his leg. And right in here, you might want it to be hotter, so you could turn up the opacity to 100 when it's right back here with his right by the ball. And if you feel like you're not a huge fan of the color, maybe you could add a hue saturation to that leg, and then you could start to push it maybe more towards a little more red. You could also change the lightness if you wanted it to look a little more white instead of orange. You just kind of have a base color to start with on the inside, and then you can begin playing around with how you really want that to look. Now, just to see the huge difference that this is making on this leg, I'm going to turn off the visibility, and you can see how natural that actually looks. And now what we want to be doing is actually adjusting our mask and maybe kind of fading this in and changing the keyframes on this for whenever we want this to be visible. So we know it doesn't start until frame 70. So at frame 70, this should be totally invisible. So I'm going to hit the T key to bring up the opacity, and we'll take that all the way down to 0 and key there. Now once we hit the ground, it's going to be up to a pretty good value. Maybe not quite to 100, but maybe somewhere in there in the 80s. So you can see that's just very slowly starting to brighten up. Okay, so then maybe right in here we can key again in the 80s, and then once it gets close to his leg, like right there, you're up to 100%. And then when we're over here, it's not going to be so visible. So probably right about there you could key again, and then say about there we're down, not really seeing a lot of relighting. And then by the time we get in here, it's starting to come back up a little bit on the front, and then when we bounce all the way through to here, it's going to be back up to 100. Okay, so you can see we just really quickly keyed that opacity to help with this. Now let's come back in the next lesson, and we'll finish kind of doing this same process on the other leg. I really want you to get that reinforced because it is a little bit difficult. So we'll be finishing up these to match. So first things first, I want to just go ahead and key the opacity while we can see this really clearly here. So we'll hit the T key on our right leg, and we'll take this down to 0 and key that. And then again, once this gets down here, this one isn't going to be quite so bright, so I'm going to take that down to a lower value. That's at something like 60. Okay, so at least that first part we'll have, and then we'll finish up the rest of those opacity keyframes once we get the inside looking good. So let's go into our right leg. And remember that we've got kind of this shape layer here, and I'm just going to duplicate this a couple of times. And remember, the first one will make our orange color, which is FF 6000, and we'll leave that at the 5 pixels we had it at. The next one is going to be that yellow color, which is FFDE00. And then that one's going to go down to about 3 pixels. That's where we were on the other one. And then we've got white at 2 pixels. Okay, so that should be looking familiar to you. And then we'll do our lens blur just like we did on our other layers. So the first one, we're going to have that blurred at a 13. The next one we have blurred at a 3. And then the last one we have blurred at a 2, same as the stroke width. Okay, then we're going to pre-compose these. We'll hit Control-Shift-C, and we'll call these, let's actually see what we called the other one just for the sake of consistency. So this is lighting shapes, but actually it should be lighting shapes left leg. So let's just rename that for the sake of consistency to lighting shapes _ left leg. And that way when we're in the right leg, and now we're back over here in the right leg, we'll hit Control-Shift-C. We'll call this lighting shapes _ right leg. Perfect. Okay, so now we can add our camera lens blur, and remember on the other one we blurred this 15 pixels and we added a glow. So in here we'll also blur this 15 pixels and we'll add a glow as well. Great. And then we can just X out of both of those. Make sure we're in our main cue here. And that should be looking pretty similar. Now, again, you may not want the same exact look. In fact, we may want to actually copy and paste our hue and saturation from the left leg to the right leg. And we also want to change our blending mode from normal to screen. So that will help as well. So now that's on screen, and I'll grab my hue saturation and hit Control C and paste it to the right leg, hit Control V. You can see that very subtly changed the color, but it did make a difference. Okay, so now let's go in and start keying that opacity. So once we're back here, our opacity isn't going to be quite as great, so maybe turn that down a little bit because it's up pretty high. But then once we get in here, we're probably up to 100 because that's really close to that part of his leg. And then this whole part here is going to be bright on his leg, so I don't want to mess with that. And here it's going to be really visible as well. So it's not until we get the ball all the way around to the front that we would start to notice any difference. So I'll key here, and then we'll just move all the way to the end and say that about here we'll be at about 50%. So that's just going to only be for a few frames that we see the difference, and it's really not even a huge noticeable difference. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this through and see if there's any adjustments we need to make. So I'm going to pause the recording for a second. I've hit the 0 key on my number pad. Actually, it's previewing pretty quickly, so we can just watch this through. And it might look a little jittery in some places just because we're watching this at about, we're watching this at half res. Really, really nice. I want you to notice right here as the ball's coming around and the light going around his leg right there, we really get the sense that that's actually happening. I love the way that interacts with his hand right there. Very cool. And so I think we can turn back on our ground relight at this point, and this actually may take a while to process. It was causing a little bit of some issues earlier. It looks like this one might take a second. So I'll go ahead and pause and we'll watch it through with all of our effects and see if there's any little tweaks we want to make. Okay, so let's watch this back now. Comes on really nicely with the light. And what's interesting about this project is at the end, when everything's rotoscoped and everything, it feels so much more natural that you don't really notice that all of these little things are there that have taken us so much time to fix and perfect. But that's really the sign of a good render, is whenever there's not anything noticeable, it's just there. And that's what a good compositor wants, is that you don't see your mark on it, you just see that everything looks right. So one thing that I might change is that I think the light on the ground looks a little yellow. So I would probably go in on here and just go back to my effects and presets and add another hue sat, and probably take the hue maybe a little more in the orange direction and lighten it up just slightly. Now it looks like if I lighten up the whole thing, it's going to, you can kind of see what's going on there. So instead of lightening the whole thing, we could just lighten inside the actual gradient ramp. So here where we have the yellow, I would just take this closer to white, just like that. And you can see how that's going to kind of change the way that coloring looks. So maybe not quite that much, maybe somewhere closer in there. Perfect. Really, really nice. And it's okay if his legs have a little bit more of a golden look than what's on the ground. We don't want the ground to be overwhelming and to me it looked a little too yellow, so I think this matches better. Now if you wanted to, you could go in and add all kinds of lens effects. We have some courses on how to add photorealistic lens effects, maybe to further integrate it a little bit more if you wanted to add some chromatic aberration, that type of thing. But really, this is all we really need to have this composited in, and you could even do some further grading if you want. But overall, it looks very well integrated for being such a graphical element. So that's really the mark of a good composite. So thank you so much for watching, and good